The incredible story of Steve Jobs, the founder of Apple, began when as a young man most of his neighbors in California in the 70s were geniuses and invented all sorts of space devices. Jobs dropped out of school, turned in bottles, ate free meals at a Krishna temple, took drugs, meditated and sought enlightenment and meaning in life. Jobs had a friend Steve Wozniak, a mega nerd and microelectronics genius who, like a magician and wizard, could build a computer using half as many chips as normal at the time. Computers were only sold as sets of boards and chips that you had to assemble and solder with your own hands. One day it snowballed into Wozniak's head to create one-piece system units so that everything would be in one box. When the invention was ready, Jobs was shocked by what he saw. Poking at the keys on the screen, letters immediately appeared. He decided that this amazing invention should bring them income. Man said, "Even if we burn, we'll have our own company. For once in our lives at least we'll know what it is." Jobs named their new company Apple Computer. The word Apple seemed familiar, like a piece of cake. It was disposable and softened the seriousness of the word computer. They talked about their invention at a home computer club. Their presentation didn't make much of an impression on the audience. But one man was interested, a computer store owner. He needed an item to sell and placed an order for 50 computers. To fulfill that order they needed to buy as much as $15,000 worth of parts, which they didn't have. So Jobs traveled up and down the Silicon Valley, looking for that money. Whenever he mentioned a computer designed for ordinary people, all the bankers reacted as if they had spit on their shoes. All he found was a loan that had to be paid back in 30 days. So work was in full swing. Computers were assembled right in Jobs' home. All his friends were brought in and his bedroom, kitchen table, and garage were transformed into a computer production facility. Jobs managed to get a huge discount on parts, so they made twice as many computers as planned. 50 were sold to the store owner, and the remaining 50 were sold off to friends. Business picked up and they assembled another 100 computers, offering them to electronics stores at 3 times the cost. But their competitors were not slumbering. In '76, computer stores were springing up like mushrooms after the rain. There were models much more presentable and solid, while their Apple model looked like sloppy wooden suitcases. Jobs realized that in order to reach the next level, the product should be sold not only assembled, but also fully equipped, so that there was no need to buy a monitor, keyboard, case and power supply separately, so that the buyers were not only hackers who build computers themselves, but also thousands of ordinary people. In those days, computers were like bulky gray metal boxes that hummed like an airplane. So Jobs designed his own white plastic case with streamlined edges to stand out among the dingy competitors. Engineers developed an innovative power supply that could run without a rattling fan. Wozniak came up with an ingenious way to display color images on the screen. But all these contrived innovations required a lot of investment in production. Jobs went to various companies, but was turned down everywhere. They said, "We don't need you, you haven't even graduated from college." Jobs had a shocking appearance, a smelly hippie in sandals, a terrible haircut, and an insolence that made his ears prick up. But Jobs didn't give up and made his way to Silicon Valley startup investing guru Don Valentino. But he too considered Jobs a marketing failure of the highest order, because Jobs himself personally went to stores and offered his wares. So Valentino flatly refused to deal with such a poor man. However, Jobs forced him to advise him on something, and Valentine sent him to marketer Michael Marcoulot, who at the age of 33 was already shoveling money and was fabulously rich. No one knew more about pricing, sales, and marketing than he did. When Marcoulot saw Jobs' computer, his jaw almost dropped. The Apple II impressed him so much that he decided to ignore the dumpy appearance of both Steves. After all, it was never too late to familiarize himself with scissors. Marcoulot was painting an exorbitant outlook. He was convinced that Apple would turn into a multi-billion-dollar business and offered $250 in exchange for a third of the stock. In the end, everyone got a share of 26%, leaving the rest for potential investors. On January 3, 1977, The new Apple Computer Corporation was officially incorporated. Markula was teaching the boys a lesson. He said that in order to succeed, you don't have to strive to get rich, you just have to do what you believe in. People judge a book by its cover first and foremost. You can create a top-notch product, but it's useless if you present it sloppily. Jobs absorbed like a sponge. At the first trade show in '77, he placed himself right in the center of the room to loudly proclaim his super genius computer, to stand out from the rest and dazzle the audience. Jobs covered his booth in velvet and made spectacular lighting. He even dressed decently for the first time in his life. In its shiny beige case, the Apple to look solid, affordable, and simple, unlike the intimidating metal boxes of its competitors. For the first time ever, people were coming to Jobs themselves, not him to them. Right at this trade show, he received an order for 300 computers. Apple was finally a real company. With a dozen employees, the team moved from the garage to an office in Cupertino. However, the new responsibilities were difficult. He was getting tougher and more oppressive by the day. He could walk up to any of his employees and tell them they were doing complete crap. Markle hated these scandals. And to rein in the overexcited Jobs, he hired President Michael Scott, who had one job: to tame Jobs. But for Jobs, giving the reins to someone else was a death sentence. He recognized no one's authority, and this inevitably led to more conflict. Jobs thundered, throwing tantrums at every slightest occasion and often brought even himself to tears. Nevertheless, Apple thrived. Disgustingly smelly, like a rotten bum, Jobs made zero impression on investors. But as soon as they poked at the Apple II, they immediately invested. On December 12, 1980, Apple went public. Shares were offered at $22. In just 1 hour, they went public at $4 million. Apple became the most successful company in the history of the stock exchange in 25 years. Jobs became fabulously rich with a fortune of $256 million. There were few competitors, and thanks to the Apple II model, sales skyrocketed from 2,077 to 200,081. But that wasn't enough for Jobs. He wanted to leave a mark on the universe. He hoped to make that mark with the Apple III, with more memory, a bigger screen, and industrial design. But as demand for computers accelerated, Apple drowned in its own fat, stopped noticing its own mistakes, and turned into an obese bureaucracy. And the department that worked on the Apple III was like a passing yard. In addition, Jobs rudely interfered with the project every time. His abnormal desire for perfection forced him to make the case almost microscopic. Therefore, the board turned out to be an excessive density of components and bad connectors, which often failed. Therefore, the release of the Apple III in May of the 80th year failed miserably, and when the machine finally worked, it was too late. Reputation fell below the plinth, and sales by IBM computers came first. The faults were blamed on the engineers, and Jobs washed his hands of the problem and withdrew. He began to think about how to create something absolutely unlike anything else. At the time, the whole of America was obsessed with VCRs. Almost every family was eager to buy one, and computers were seen as something super obscure. Computers used DOS queries. That made the hell of it, so it had to be the eighth wonder of the world for computers to become as popular as VCRs. However, the Xerox PARC Research Center was already working on such a miracle, a super simple computer, one that even a drunken novice could figure out. Instead of DOS queries, they came up with graphics, a desktop with documents and folders that magically opened at the click of a mouse. It seemed like magic at the time. This project was highly classified. But in '79, Xerox was eager to invest in Apple, and Jobs agreed on the condition that they reveal all their secrets. Xerox decided that the capacity of these upstarts' minds was not enough to understand their super genius invention, and agreed. When Jobs came to Xerox to familiarize himself with the new miracle technology, Xerox decided to fool him and showed him not everything. Jobs demanded more, but each time he was shown the wrong thing, some other frivolous program to take his eyes off the main secret. Jobs realized he was being fooled and said, "We've had enough of this nonsense." He called Xerox's venture capital chief and complained. And when Jobs' team finally got to see the invention in full, they were astonished. Engineer Bill Atkinson stared at every pixel, almost climbing into the screen with his head. Jobs jumped around the computer waving his arms excitedly and shouting, "This is a gold mine." It was as if a veil had fallen from Jobs' eyes. He was stunned and finally realized Xerox had gotten the promised 100,000 shares of Apple stock, the price of $1 million. But from the outside it looked like the Tatar Mongol horde robbed the defenseless peasants. However, one idea is not enough. The main thing is the realization, and Jobs did it perfectly. They made the mouse graceful and comfortable, made the case as simple as a toaster. Engineers very noticeably reduced the area of the case, shoving the system under the screen, improved the interface, commands added smoothness. The computer was called the Macintosh. While they were fiddling with it, in August '81, IBM released its computer. Jobs believed that if he lost this battle, the computer industry would be plunged into the dark ages for 20 years. He liked to think of himself as a rebel against the evil empire, and IBM was well suited to that role. Jobs believed that fate had given him the greatest mission, to save the planet. But to save the planet you needed a good president, who had the weight of Wall Street. In '83, Jobs realized he wasn't mature enough for the job, as he was getting overexcited at the slightest thing. So the board of directors cast a rod on the chief advertising wizard of the time, John Scullia, Pepsi-Cola. But he flatly refused. And then Jobs poached him, saying the killer phrase that went down in history: "You'll be selling sugary water for the rest of your life, or you'll finally decide to do something really serious." Apple's new miracle operating system worked only on native hardware. Jobs considered the complete incompatibility with other computers a brilliant solution. However, at this time programs were being written for Apple. Then nobody, the unknown Bill Gates, saw this miracle interface with amazing graphics in Mac, and quickly realized that this miracle was the future. In '83, at a lavish conference, he solemnly announced that Microsoft was developing Windows with a graphical interface exactly like Apple's. Upon learning of this, Jobs became furious and accused Gates of shameless theft. However, Gates gave a witty reply that went down in history: "I went over to our mutual neighbor Xerox to steal a TV set and discovered that you had beaten me to it." Meanwhile, the evil empire had overtaken the Apple company. IBM sold 3 times as many computers, and their market share was up 26%, so all hope was for the Macintosh. In planning the launch of the Mac, Jobs wanted people to be numb with amazement, and in '80 for the Apple team, along with director Ridley Scott, made a commercial. It portrayed Apple as a God-chosen nation rising up against the forces of darkness. The video showed how in the gray world of propaganda the main character in bright clothes personified Macintosh. Through her rebellious actions, she symbolized the revolution. The science fiction-inspired commercial alluded to IBM's total domination and George Orwell's prophecy. IBM epitomized the evil empire, and Apple represented the rebel alliance that liberates people from oblivion. However, the board of directors only had a vomit-inducing urge for this $750,000 commercial. They thought it was the worst commercial they had ever seen. But there was no turning back. Airtime had already been purchased during the Super Bowl of soccer, a time when half the population of the United States gathers around the screens. Every second of airtime is worth its weight in gold, and 30 seconds is worth more than $5 million. In the end, the entire country watched as the ominous music provided eerie visuals, marching crowds, and bold, disturbing, and mysterious footage. The clip was unlike any other, and 9.6 million viewers that night had all the TV stations raving. It is said that only about this clip had an effect that exploded like a bomb, because at the time most young people thought computers were tools of power that turned people into a herd of obedient robots. And the commercial captured the spirit of the revolution. The commercial hinted that Apple was up against a sinister clan of large corporations trying to enslave the world and people's minds. The commercial resonated well with the mood of Americans, also because at the time the Cold War was in full swing with the Soviet totalitarian regime, which President Reagan then called the evil empire. For the first 100 days, Mac sold out like hotcakes. But when the wave of excitement subsided and the illusion crumbled, it turned out to be not such a fat steak. With sales fell below the plinth, Mac turned out to be terribly slow and no advertising did not help. You had to pay for a pretty picture. More power was needed. The Macintosh had too little memory. There was no built-in hard disk and the lack of a fan led to frequent crashes. When customers realized all this, sales plummeted. Jobs believed that everything he touched would turn into a masterpiece, so he didn't test it. The Mac lacked programs, had no expansion sockets, had a small screen. The computer would spit out a floppy diskette for the slightest reason, and something required the user. At the time, IBM supported 1,000 programs. Because of the endless edits made by the Jobs, the price of a Macintosh rose to $2,000. Jobs saw the horrifying picture of store clerks showing customers the IBM first, and those who wanted a Mac were still reoriented to the same IBM. As a result, sales were plummeting. Jobs was fed up with the situation and the engineers became depressed. For several months they could not do anything and many talented people left the company. The big news was the departure of veteran Wozniak. He considered it the height of stupidity to underestimate the Apple II model, which was still the company's main revenue generator. Warehouses were overflowing with a huge inventory of unsold Apple computers, and the company was in a panic. Jobs himself was largely considered the culprit. He had created a computer for organizations, but advertised it to regular people. If Jobs had taken his time, perhaps the picture would have been different. However, he always felt that he had a short time, and therefore had to hurry to get everything done. Jobs was supposed to control Scully, but Scully became a puppeteer of sorts. He charmed Scully so much that he lost his head and began to think he was special. The more Jobs manipulated him, the more he despised him. Disagreements increasingly bothered the board of directors, and Jobs' mood swings became more and more violent. He could humiliate and trash anyone he met in the hallway. His subordinates saw the company as a rudderless boat, hurtling toward the abyss. As a result, Scully removed Jobs from the Macintosh project. However, Jobs was not going to give up so easily. He plotted a coup and began to lure people to his side. But Scully found out about it, and at the board of directors strictly set the conditions: either he or Jobs. Everyone voted in favor of Scully. Jobs was knocked out, trampled into dust. Many employees were unhappy with Jobs' dismissal. The company was no longer good for creativity, and they left with Jobs. The board members, upon learning of this, reacted extremely harshly. Many were furious, believing that Jobs had fooled them. Members were stunned by Jobs' treacherous act, who secretly planned to steal the most valuable employees from under their noses. All the traitors were unceremoniously dragged off the company premises, and Jobs was sued. Apple's stock rose 7% afterward as shareholders were relieved that the California sloth was no longer in charge from now on. Steve was defeated but not destroyed. He wasn't about to go into the shadows. One day, while hanging around universities, Jobs met a biochemist who bemoaned the fact that without a powerful computer it took a whole week just to do a single experiment. Upon hearing this, Jobs was inspired to produce powerful computers for universities and founded a new company called Nex. Jobs wanted to create a computer in the shape of a perfect black cube that epitomized solidity. Mimicking the Japanese in Jobs, he built an expensive robot factory, and money from his own pocket went out like through his fingers. In September 1986, the entire schedule went down the drain. There were $20,000 chairs in the factory, and the company was facing bankruptcy. To find additional funds, Jobs put up 10% of the stock for $3 million, an amount he took from the ceiling. The company had no accomplishments, no products, and no revenue up to this point, so no investor was in a hurry to put money into Nex. However, Jobs caught the eye of Texas-based Rosso Perot, who got into Jobs' ideas and invested $20 million for a 16% stake in the company. Wherever he went, Perot praised Jobs in front of everyone. But Bill Gates treated the project differently. He called Jobs machine junk with an idiotic body and predicted the project's failure. In October 1988, Jobs held a brilliant presentation of Nex, causing a storm of excitement. However, interest quickly waned and the computer was quickly forgotten. When Nex sales finally began in 1989, they did not exceed a paltry 400 units per month. Next had few compatible programs, cheaper counterparts, or on the market. And the expensive factory was idle. And the company was losing money. Jobs was gloatingly called a one-hit wonder because he had no accomplishments besides the Apple II model. There was nothing but failure. Design alone is not enough to make a computer sell well. Jobs' holy empire was crumbling, while Microsoft grew like on yeast, becoming the navel of the earth. In '94, Apple's sales fell below the plinth too, since they kicked Jobs out. Their innovative fervor had gone for naught, while Microsoft was reaping the rewards of successfully copying an idea. In '95, Windows became the most successful operating system of all time, while Macintosh's profits were on the brink of disaster, seeing Microsoft rapidly eating up market share and Windows computers flying off the shelves. Apple executives backed away from Jobs' principle and allowed the Macintosh operating system license to be sold to other manufacturers. However, this made things even worse for computer sales. They fell to unattainable lows. Management believed that the only way to save themselves was to sell the company, but no one wanted to buy a lame horse with one foot already in the grave. Jobs could have absorbed Apple and become the head of his brainchild again, but he didn't want a forced takeover. He wanted them to call him out on it. They wanted to get their hands on his operating system. That was the plan, to enslave Jobs. Apple buys him, and that gives him the right to get on the board of directors. And from there it's a short walk to the CEO position. And Apple fell for it in '96. They bought next for $426 million. Bill Gates was furious when he heard about it. He thought that the bearded shaman had fooled Apple and sold them some unnecessary garbage. At first in '97, Jobs did not interfere much in the company's affairs and was at Apple as an unofficial consultant. He was used only for show, but gradually he began to promote his people to key positions. Meanwhile, under the old management, Apple was barely moving and sales were going down the drain, and at some point Jobs was finally invited to take over as CEO. But Jobs declined. Despite this, he had real power. The head of Apple at the time was Ed Woolard. Even he considered leaving. Amid the company's disastrous situation in '97, staff turnover was flowing in abundant rivers. To stop it, Jobs decided to finally intervene with management and renegotiate employee option prices. But the directors reared up like mad horses. Jobs then declared that otherwise he was leaving the company and would never come back, since he doesn't have time to coddle the board, and demanded that everyone resign. Only then would he return. Only Woolard could stay. The power was on Jobs' side. In this situation, many people wanted to leave. Even Markle's father had quit. Jobs finally took over as CEO. By this time, Jobs had gained wisdom and matured. As soon as the power was in his hands, he immediately banned the license for the Macintosh operating system and began to destroy the proliferating clones. Jobs thought it was the most idiotic thing in the world to let lazy computer makers use his super operating system and grab a piece of the profits with their dirty tentacles. The company baked like pancakes, multiple model variations of each product. It was pure insanity. Tons of completely unnecessary products. Even the employees themselves didn't know what they were doing anymore. Jobs cut the product line by 70%. Jobs' ability to concentrate saved Apple. The first year he laid off more than 3,000 employees. After 2 years of staggering losses, when bankruptcy was within reach, Apple finally squeezed out a profit. News of Jobs' return to the helm lifted Apple's stock from $13 to $20. At the Mac World Conference in August '97, loyal Apple fans greeted Jobs like a rock star. At the speech, Jobs suddenly announced a partnership with Microsoft, which would invest $150 million in Apple. The bitter enemies were suddenly united. By then, Microsoft was already king of the mountain in the market. So Jobs needed Jobs' friendship with Gates to buy time and climb out of the bottom. On this news, the stock skyrocketed in just one day, adding $830 million to the company's value. Apple had one foot in the grave and suddenly came back to life. In the computer industry, all the manufacturers were creating the same gray boxes, outsourcing production and competing only on price. Jobs decided that a revolutionary device had to match. In most companies, designers dance to the tune of the manufacturers, but Jobs did the opposite. First the design, and then the engineers adjust to the case. That's how the crazy futuristic iMac appeared in 1998, with a transparent case made of turquoise plastic that looked like a giant blob. At the time, this computer looked like it had been teleported from the future. Instead of pale blocks of individual monitors and a pile of wires, it was a remarkably sleek device. In those days, people feared and shunned technology, but iMac owners put it in the most prominent place in their homes to make guests jealous. People swept the computers off the shelves like wildlings. By the end of the year, 800,000 had been sold. Bill Gates assured everyone around him that this success was temporary. Jobs was outraged by the fact that his super innovative computers were on the same shelves as disgusting consumer products like cases, and salespeople didn't even bother to explain the differences. These stores were located somewhere in the middle of nowhere. So Jobs decided to build his own stores. He designed every tiny detail of the minimalist interior himself. Analysts amicably predicted failure, and the board of directors was not thrilled with Jobs' crazy new idea either. Many firms went bankrupt when they opened their own chain, and it seemed crazy. However, in 2004, Apple stores were already being visited by more than 5,000 people a week, and profits had reached more than $1 billion, an all-time record for retail. When a new location opened, visitors slept at the door to be the first to get in. But the problems with the stores simply paled in comparison to the ominous darkness that hung over the digital world in 2001. In the 90s, the word internet sounded like a magic spell. Investors went crazy and everyone was scrambling to invest in dot-coms. But the dot-com bubble burst and the Nasdaq index collapsed by almost 50%. Everyone said the song of the computer age was over. But Jobs thought it would be good for them. And while competitors tightened their belts, Apple kept inventing and turned the computer into a digital hub, the heart for all other gadgets that controlled and synchronized. Now sticking a camera in and uploading video to disk was a cakewalk, thanks to the iMovie program. Even a stiff pensioner could easily edit a cool blockbuster with special effects and music. However, Apple had a headache when synchronizing with music. In 2000, everyone like mad began to copy music to computers and record their own compilations on discs. About 320 million blank CDs were sold in the US that year. But back then, all the programs were extremely awkward and complicated. In 2001, Jobs created iTunes, a disk-burning program, as part of that very heart. But that wasn't enough. It needed iTunes to connect well with existing music players. But at the time, all players were total crap, like they were made in hell. And it was impossible for me to use. And they only held a measly 16 songs, and because Jobs loved listening to music, he decided to make his own player. It took 1 year to make. Such an unrealistically fast time was achieved because Jobs waved his whip in front of his employees like a prison guard in front of his slaves. He believed that if you want a super team, you have to be ruthless. The weak attract the weak. Jobs' ruthlessness paid off. Dozens of resentful employees ended their sob stories by admitting that Jobs had gotten them things they could never have dreamed of. Jobs knew how to brainwash and infect his team with the drive and confidence that they could do the impossible. And people did the impossible because they didn't know what was impossible. That's how the iPod came to be, with a coin-sized hard drive that held 1,000 songs and ran for 10 hours without recharging. You could get to any track with just 3 touches. Next to the iPod, all the other players looked like they were made somewhere in Uzbekistan. But the public was skeptical as a bot. With its exorbitant price of $400 in 2001, the internet joked that the name iPod stood for idiots, demanded a lot of money. Nevertheless, sales soon skyrocketed. You could see a person with white headphones in every neighborhood. Following the good sales, the iPod spurred sales of iMac computers. So Jobs blew even more on iPod advertising, an astronomical $75 million, which was 100 times what his competitors were spending. And with that, he swept the market under him. But in 2002, Apple faced a new problem in the music industry. To upload music to the iPod, you had to download it from the internet. And in those days the internet was filled with pirate services. Piracy in those days brought everyone to their knees. It was the Wild West all around. Record companies were frantically searching for a way to protect themselves, and they weren't the only ones suffering. It was common for people downloading free music to encounter viruses and terrible quality. Jobs realized that the best way to combat theft was to create an alternative because 80% of the people stealing music simply had no choice, so Jobs created the iTunes Store, an online music store. He convinced the major record companies to allow music to be sold there not as albums, but as individual songs, each for 99 cents. Because usually music albums have only 2 or 3 good tracks and the rest is dull crap. Many musicians' contracts prohibited them from selling music individually, so Jobs had to personally persuade some of the artists. When Jobs showed Dr. Dre the iPod and iTunes interaction, he exclaimed, "Well, finally somebody's done it." When it opened in 2003, the store had 200,000 songs. In the first 6 days, it sold 1 million pieces. But many people couldn't use the iTunes Store because the store didn't work on Windows. No one thought that day would ever come, but in 2003, Apple made a version of iTunes for its nemesis, Windows. Jobs was asked by reporters, "What's it like to be a Windows developer?" Jobs replied, "It's the same as handing a glass of ice water to someone in hell." In 2004, Apple dominated the player market. Previously, to get a celebrity to appear in a commercial, you had to pay them an astronomical amount of money. But now musicians themselves dreamed of appearing in iPod commercials because it guaranteed them a stunning success. For example, Bob Dylan, completely forgotten by everyone, promoted his iPod in his music video, and in the first week took the first place in the Billboard iTunes chart. He could literally catapult anyone onto the pedestal of fame. In sales, iPods were amazing. In 2000, 5 million were sold, in 2005 already 20 million. But suddenly around the world began to appear phones with a built-in player. This meant only one thing: iPod would soon be dead. Camcorders were already starting to sell worse because of it. Jobs realized that if they didn't make a phone, they would be left at an empty trough. He noticed one oddity. At the time, all the phones on the market were ugly as peeled bricks, and while you figure them out, your brain would explode. All this pervasive stupidity inspired him to create a truly usable phone. Plus, right about that time, the phone market was just going from strength to strength. Jobs realized that if a super product emerged among the grey dairy, it would have the same resounding success that the iPod had had. In 2004, Apple employees began to notice which colleagues were mysteriously disappearing from the office and never reappearing. No one could explain where they disappeared to. Thus, Jobs was recruiting people for a secret lab to build an epic device. The engineers considered themselves elite and hardly ever left the lab. They ate, showered, slept, and celebrated holidays and worked in the same place. At the time, touchscreens had already arrived, but they all worked with a stylus. Jobs believed that if you offer a stylus, you're dead. So his elite engineers created a touch without a stylus. As a result, you could move a picture on the screen with a swipe of your finger. At the time, this seemed unrealistic. Keyboard buttons took up a lot of screen space. So the elite engineers made the buttons virtual, which appear only when you need them. The screen took up all the space, all the way to the edges of the case, with only a thin bezel around the edges. The result was the iPhone, which combined 3 devices: a player, a computer, and a phone. When the iPhone went on sale in 2007, competitors thought it was too expensive for its $500 price tag. Business people won't use a phone without a keyboard, they thought. But by the end of 2010, Apple was selling 90 million iPhones. The company had snatched more than half the profits of the global cell phone market. Fans called the iPhone the Jesus phone. Now, thanks to this versatile device, Apple's budget is bigger than even the US Treasury Department. On October 5, 2011, the day after the 4th iPhone was unveiled, Steve Jobs died. He was 56. Unheard of mourning enveloped the entire planet. All the stores turned into temples. When Jobs discovered a pancreatic tumor, he treated it for a long time with various herbs and roots. So the cancer had time to spread to other organs, and doctors were powerless. It's not often you meet a 40-year-old innovator. But Jobs' business took off just as he turned 40. Jobs proved that even after 40, a person can remain inspired. He was always puzzled as to why those over 30 start thinking in narrow patterns and stop following progress. People get stuck in these patterns like a needle in a broken record, and then they can't get free from them at all. And sour when a person does not lose interest in life and retains childlike curiosity until death. Jobs glorify madmen and rebels, all those who think differently unconventionally. Jobs' marketing somehow made people believe that they were free, creative, progressive rebels just because they used Apple. In this brand positioning, Jobs was inspired by the approach of Nike, which was the first to come up with the idea of praising not the product itself, but those who use it. The main thing is the impossibilities of the product, but the possibilities of their owners.